Okay, so Aidan, take it away.
Thanks, Eloise. Just share my slides. Is that worked? All fine? Perfect.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me along today to kind of give a discussion around what I've spent the last few years of my life looking at and really trying to research in terms of the potential for human rights budgeting in Scotland. I'm currently about to go into my third year, so my last year of my PhD, which hopefully means that some of this research is kind of further along the line than it originally was in Scotland. And as Eloise was saying, I'm kind of based at 3 different institutions, so across the University of Glasgow, the University of Stirling, as well as the Scottish Human Rights Commission. So it kind of gives a broad sweep of kind of some of the institutions and areas that are looking at this. I also want to kind of give a shout to, there's the Human Rights Budgeting Working Group, who my supervisors sit on, as well as some other kind of academics and people from around Scotland who have also been pushing some of this work forward. So really, it's not just me, but quite a team of people that are really focusing on human rights budgeting in Scotland. Now, I wanted to really start the conversation around the kind of overlaps that we have when we're looking at different budgeting techniques. So we've been, today in the understanding that Catholic really is focused on well-being as well as children and that kind of early years. So it may be a bit of a surprise to come in and kind of have a discussion on human rights budgeting, but really a lot of what this slide shows, I hope, is that these areas are very much interwoven and kind of overlapping with one another. They might have some very specific differences and specific areas of focus, if you like. But really what they're all trying to do is kind of promote human rights as well as promote well-being and some more specific principles of those, such as participation or non-discrimination, which is something that we see really strongly with something like gender budgeting. So while today I'm going to be working and focusing on human rights, I want it to be kind of understood that really you can use a lot of these frameworks for improving well-being or improving human rights in Scotland. So really it's going to take a lot of different practitioners and a lot of different academics who have been working in these areas to come together and really use the budget as a tool for kind of promoting rights and well-being in Scotland. Today, we're going to kind of look at children's budgeting as well, a little bit more in depth than participatory or gender budgeting. But again, these are really important aspects of human rights, and that kind of we place human rights really at the center of that diagram because of the accountability. So really the reason that I've been focusing on human rights budgeting is due to the fact that human rights have a very strong legal framework behind them. So we have our international laws that protect them. We then have regional, so things like the European Convention of Human Rights. And then we even have our kind of own domestic legislation around things like the Human Rights Act 1998. So we can use human rights as more of a legal accountability than, say, coming at it from a well-being perspective. Okay. So really just to kind of re-emphasize that, as we know, I hope we know, and if not, then this is a very important kind of development in Scotland, is that we are looking at human rights incorporation. And what that really means is taking these international human rights treaties that have been ratified by countries, so signed up to by countries, And what we're doing is taking the kind of obligations and the principles of those treaties, the rights of those treaties, and giving them protection in our domestic legal system. So allowing our domestic courts to have a say. Now that requires us to legislate for it. So that's what we've seen through the UNCRC bill. But we also may see with the kind of anticipated human rights bill that we're going to be incorporating more of these international treaties. One of which budgeting is highly important, which is the International Covenant for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And I'm going to come on to some of the obligations in a minute, but I think it's just really important to remember that incorporation is really a huge development in Scotland. And this is what's giving rise to a lot of the kind of human rights work that's going on at the moment, including budgeting.
Aidan, I'm really sorry to interrupt. For me, the sound is coming up a little bit choppy, so I was wondering if you could maybe turn off your video to see if that improves. We can still get you, but it's just a little bit choppy, so I was thinking maybe that would help.
Sure, no, happy to turn off. Let me know if it's any better.
Okay, will do.
Great. So one of the important kind of important aspects of the UNCRC bill that gives rise to budgeting is the fact that it has been provided with such guidance at the international level, and that's really been recognised, I think, by Scottish government, and the fact that their policy memorandum and kind of financial memorandum accompanying the bill sets out this kind of child's rights scheme, and as a part of that, they want to see how public institutions in Scotland are adopting human rights within their budgeting processes. So really, we are seeing at a kind of policy level in Scotland as well a move towards human rights and budgets really being interwoven with another. So where does it really come from? So the idea of human rights and budgets kind of being, so interlinked and important for one another. And really, the idea is that all human rights require, all human rights protection and promotion requires the mobilization of resources. So, we think about things from schools and education to health and social care to funding of kind of democratic institutions and votes, to our local authorities. All of this stuff requires state resources, but they're also key to delivering on people's basic human rights. So human rights really offers us a framework from which to build, fairer, more just decisions that are founded within the ideas of human rights, but also as a tool for advocates of human rights to hold government to account when they don't. So really, we want to use it as both a framework and an approach for making decisions, but also as a tool for us to hold government to account when they haven't done that, haven't gone through the correct processes. And the really prominent human rights scholar kind of says it better than I can, Aoife Nolan says, budgets are a key sign of government's values. So if human rights are not in there, what's being said is that they are not a value worth counting. So really, we're trying to use this to further human rights visibility within our budgeting process. I want to just give kind of one example of how it can be used, and this is taken from the Treatment Action Campaign case in South Africa. And this was running through the kind of early 2000s, and really what happened in the case was they could highlight that health spent in the area in South Africa was nowhere near what the government had committed itself to doing, and it was nowhere near enough to prevent and protect people from the AIDS epidemic. So when they were litigating this, the lawyers on the case used budgetary tools to highlight how expenditure within South Africa was not meeting the requirements needed to prevent the AIDS epidemic. And that was really taken into account by the court of saying, is the government really meeting its responsibilities in this area? So, I mean, that's just one case example of a number from around the world that kind of I used in my studies to really emphasize this stuff. But I think it highlights how important it can be to use as a tool, the budget, for really understanding whether the government is taking its responsibilities seriously. Now, I'm going to run through this quite quickly because I realize that this legal jargon can really put people to sleep, but it's very important to understand where some of these obligations come from and what we can use from the international legal sphere to really advocate for human rights budgeting. And so within our International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, it states that each party must take to the present covenant, undertakes to take steps individually and through international assistance and cooperation, especially economic and technical, to the maximum of its available resources with a view of achieving progressively the full realization of the rights. And to the table to the side, I've kind of highlighted what some of the key obligations are within this idea of progressive realization. So what it's saying is that the resources that a state has must be used in the best manner possible to the maximum available to really realize and promote human rights. So that idea of maximum available resources. We then have an idea of non-retrogression, which is where states might make cutbacks in certain, so things like austerity and other such really bring non-retrogression and kind of moving back, taking deliberately backward steps on rights. And then we have this final really important aspect of it, which is called minimum core obligations. And what minimum core is saying is that there should be a level of rights that no one can fall behind. Now it's connected to things like a social minimum or understandings of social contract and other such, but it's really important because what it does is say we can set a threshold in Scotland of a level of rights that we shouldn't be falling behind. And if they are, then we can use the budget as a tool to see whether that threshold is being met, that threshold of expenditure is being met. So minimum core is a really, really important tool that I use in my research to kind of emphasize why budgeting is so important to the realization of rights. Now, I understand we're kind of here to discuss children as well and children's rights in the UNCRC bill. So just to kind of emphasize how important and where the legal aspect of this comes from, the Article 4 of the UNCRC really kind of echoes the language of the ISESCA, the other covenant, in the idea that it's saying undertake such measures to the maximum extent of their available resources. We've also been provided some further guidance from international committees here. So highlighted a general comment, which is based on children's rights and public budgets. It was provided in 2016. It really highlights that all government branches, levels, and structures that play a role in devising public budgets shall exercise their functions in a way that's consistent with the general principles of the convention. So the quotes there really, again, just re-emphasize this idea that you can't look at human rights realization without also bringing into account budgetary decision making, and this is going to be a really important tool of implementation for the UNCRC in Scotland. When we're looking at whether the UNCRC is going to be successful and really lead to this transformational change that people hope it will. It needs to be analyzed in a way of looking at it. Are we spending the money in the right way? Are we prioritizing our resources for children's rights? And that's really what this general comment is asking us to do. It's saying, are we maximizing the resources available to us for children's rights in Scotland? Now, I don't have time to kind of go into the real practical steps of how you conduct human rights budgeting and how we would be kind of taking the Scottish budget or local authority budgets, because that's also a hugely important aspect. The fact that this exists both at the national level, but also our local authorities. We can see that in the diagram to the left, there was over 11.6 billion spent by local or allocated to local authorities for key services like education and social care, which of course are key to upholding people's rights. So really, we can use this tool both at the local level in Scotland and the national level. But some of the questions that we really are asking ourselves when we're kind of looking at human rights and budgeting, we split it, or I certainly do, into this idea of generational funds the allocation and the spend. So generation, we're thinking about it in terms of a pie, and in terms of, you know, our pie might be full, but is it as big a pie as we could have possibly made? So that's really bringing in questions around, like, are we maximizing the resources available in Scotland? So it might be things around taxation. You know, are we taxing in a way that is equitable and in a way that is more fair, both at the local and national level? So are we increasing our pie as much as possible so that we can spend money on realizing rights? We would then also look at allocation of money. So this is where the kind of process budgeting comes in, and how we split up that pie, what slice goes where, and what priorities are really setting that, you know? So what level does, you know, for example, deprivation play? You know, are we focusing and prioritizing resources on deprived areas in Scotland? Are human rights explicitly allocated for when we're splitting up that pie? Can we follow where human rights are really being financially resourced? And finally, we look at the kind of expenditure of that. So once the money's been allocated, how are we spending it? Are we spending it in the right way? And again, are we, you know, spending it in priority areas? What happens when you underspend? So when perhaps over allocated, what happens to the money that wasn't spent? So these are really kind of the questions that we can begin to ask ourselves and begin to analyze when we're looking at the Scottish budget or local authority budgets. And that's where we're kind of trying to build in accountability and saying, well, you've committed to these legal obligations. And to meet those legal obligations, it's very clear that we need to use the budget as a tool. So why within our budget is it so difficult to understand? Firstly, very, very difficult for those of us without an accounting background to really access the budget and understand how the formulas work and how we're really spending the money. So that's, you know, a key aspect. But then also, are we really focusing on promoting human rights, or other areas that we're spending perhaps too much priority on? So these are kind of how we, the very basics of looking at human rights budgeting. Kind of as a final slide before, because I realize there's not a huge amount of us and it's probably easier for us to have just a discussion around this stuff, but I want to highlight some of the work from the Scottish Human Rights Commission here and others who have been working in this area, such as the Human Rights Budgeting Working Group. And the framework that's really being developed here is this idea of the human rights-based approach in Scotland. So we call them the panel principles. Sometimes they're called the Nepal principles because people prefer the order, but here they're presented as the panel principles. And what they do is they provide us with these overarching ideas, these overarching principles that we can apply when we're looking at the budget. So has the process been participatory? And participation isn't just necessarily, have they consulted with you on it? You know, have they put out a wide range consultation that's then, but participation is really about power sharing. It's about listening. It's about impact of that participation. So has participation in the budget led to changes in decision making? Now that it's important to think that also, you know, it may be different for children's rights as it would be for adults. If you're applying the same principles, but perhaps at a children's level, you know, that participation would take a different form. It would be about kind of hearing that voice of the children and really allowing for them to access the information in a way that's successful. We're also looking at things like accountability. So, you know, are people accountable for the decisions that are being made? That's that really legal aspect that comes in. Is the budget non-discriminatory? You know, are women and minorities within Scotland really being accounted for within the budget, or does it benefit certain areas of society more than others? So this is another really important question. Is the budget empowering? So again, that kind of comes down to around participation, and are we allowing people to really be involved within the process? And then finally, we look at law. So are we really in keeping with these international legal obligations as they're set out? Are the decisions that are being taken, are they based in law, or are these processes not really aligned to the legal side of things? So the panel principles allow us this kind of framework to really access the budget and begin asking questions based around kind of principles and human rights. So I have a slide on some further reading, just in case anyone is really interested in kind of how we can use budgets to realize human rights. But just to kind of final, because I realize that again, that's been on human rights. And, I see human rights and well-being as very, they are from different disciplines, and human rights generally are dealt with from the legal sphere, but often, and I think as reports show that approaches to well-being really need to be rights-based. So rights provide that kind of legal background, and well-being in many aspects provides an understanding of what it's like when rights are met. When people have their human rights, then generally speaking, we'll see higher levels of well-being. So they are frameworks that are kind of complementary to another. So I really don't want to see them as existing in a conflict, or suggesting that one group of people should be looking at well-being budgets where another looks at human rights budgets. Really, we should all be looking at how we can utilize kind of budgeting and this analysis of resources in Scotland to kind of further rights and well-being. And I'll stop there because I realize that there's probably some questions and other such. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Aidan. I'm just going to finish the recording.